And so we finally come to the end of our long journey about the Peloponnesian War and ancient Athenian history in the 5th century BC. All turns out very badly for the Athenians in this period. What is remarkable, however, is that in the aftermath of this great war, the Athenians actually would rise bigger and better than ever in the 4th and even further centuries BC. They would never again, however, have the high prestige that they were able to capture in the 5th century BC under Pericles. And although literature continues to be produced across the Greek world of many different types, this special character of the Athenian literature in the 5th century BC would never again be duplicated in subsequent centuries. So let's now conclude the Peloponnesian War with the result that went against the Athenians in favor of the Spartans in 405 and then eventually in 404 BC. So the conclusion of the war, like practically the entire war, happened practically by accident. And it occurred at a location called Aegospotami. If you look on your map in the northeast corner of the Aegean Sea, you'll see a very narrow strait, which is not far from the Hellespont Strait. Aegospotami, which in Greek means the narrowing of a river, is on the it would actually be the right side if you think of being downstream, but it's on the left side visually on your map, the left west coast of the Hellespont. And there's a city called Lampsacus that's a little bit southeast of it on the other coast, and Lampsacus was an Athenian allied city. So in 405 BC, after the death of Callicratidas, Lysander took a command once again of the Spartan fleet. He moved up to Lampsacus and seized it. The Athenians responded by bringing their fleet to the opposite coast to this location, Aegospotami. It happened that Alcibiades witnessed this from a cliff nearby, and when the Athenians beached their ships there, Alcibiades came down to have a talk with them. Now, one of the problems that triremes do present is that because of their narrow keels and because of the threat of rotting, Greeks who were going to use triremes could not leave them in the water for too long. Where possible, the ships had to be beached so that they could stay in good shape. So the Athenians drew their ships onto the beach at this location, Aegospotami, in order to prepare to take on Lysander and the Spartans over at Lampsacus. Alcibiades, however, came down and warned them that they were at a vulnerable location because they could be quickly attacked by the Spartans, who were close enough to be able to keep an eye on Athenian activities there. However, Alcibiades' advice was soundly rejected because the Athenians basically said to the traitor, "Go away, we're in charge here. You have no part in anything that we're doing." As a result, the Athenians did not change their minds, and they kept their fleet there at Aegospotami. So, next day, Lysander brought a portion of his fleet around as if mounting an attack against the Athenian fleet. Quickly, the Athenians got their men together on board their ships and hurried out, expecting to fight a sea battle. However, when they arrived, Lysander called off the battle and left. As a result, the Athenians simply brought their ships back into the beach and were able to relax for the rest of the day. Next day, Lysander did the same thing. And once again, the Athenians went out to meet him with their ships. And once again, Lysander broke off. And once again, the Athenians went back to the beach and did nothing further. Third day, Lysander did the same thing. And once again, the Athenians went out to meet him. And again, he broke off. And again, the Athenians went back to the beach. Following day, the Athenians tried a trick. One of their generals named Philocles tried to sail past Lysander's anchored fleet in order to try to lure the Spartans too far out into the open sea so that the Athenian backup fleet could then come and catch them from the rear and be able to drive the Spartans away. Lysander, however, was able to spot Philocles coming down. He may have come down too slowly, and as a result, when Philocles came down within striking distance, Lysander struck as fast as he could and pushed Philocles back off to the beach. And once again was there with a menacing gesture. And once again, the Athenians came out to save Philocles and then did not engage in battle immediately again. So the Athenians again went back to the beach. Lysander took his ships out of sight, but kept an eye on what the Athenians were doing. The Athenians dismounted off their ships, thinking that that would be all for the day. Lysander watched and watched and watched, and finally gave a signal, and the Spartans brought their entire fleet up to the beach and caught the entire Athenian fleet. Conon actually was able to give a signal when he saw the Spartans coming in, but it was too late. Conon actually jumped on board a ship and escaped with a few other ships, and the state trireme, the Paralus, also got away so that it was able to get word to the Athenians. But the entire rest of the fleet was destroyed. Lysander routed up all the Athenians. According to Xenophon, he put them all in a row, asked each one of them, of the prisoners in a row, "Did you do anything to help the Spartans during the war?" The Athenians, of course, said no, and Lysander killed each one after another, apparently in very grotesque ways. Word got around to the Athenians, and the story goes, according to Xenophon, that the mourning started from the Piraeus harbor, when the word first got in, all the way up the long walls as a wave of lamentation, when the Athenians finally realized that they had lost the war completely, because the Spartans were then able to come around to the Piraeus harbor with their fleet and blockade it, and the Athenians were simply cut off of supplies and had no further ways of fighting or getting supplies, because the Spartans, of course, also had that critical land fort up at Decelean. So the Athenians were helpless. They were hamstrung. So the Athenians prepared for a siege, and they feared greatly that the same treatment that they had meted out against the Melians would now be visited upon them. There were negotiations during the winter, and one of the principal points of negotiations was whether the Athenians would be able to keep a portion of their fleet, their democracy, and especially, most importantly, their long walls, which, of course, were very bitterly hated by the Spartans. However, the Spartans simply marked time. By the spring of 404 BC, the Athenians offered unconditional surrender. The terms of the peace were, first of all, had to be determined by a meeting of the Spartan allies, many of whom, including Thebes and Corinth, wanted to see the city of Athens razed to the ground. The Spartans, however, overturned that recommendation, and because they had the final vote, having the most authority in the Peloponnesian League, the Spartans voted not to destroy Athens because the Athenians had provided such wonderful service for the Greeks, both at Marathon and at Salamis. Not surprisingly, the Thebans and the Corinthians were outraged at the Spartans for making this decision, but there was nothing at the time that they could do about it. So the Spartans did vote to confiscate the Athenian ships, except for only the minimum few that they would need to do their basic trade. The Athenian democracy was suspended, and 30 oligarchs were put in their place, and the Athenians became a subject ally of Sparta and would be now required to go wherever the Spartans called them, should the Spartans get out on campaign anyplace. And finally, most important of all, and most bitter for the Athenians, the Spartans destroyed the long walls. The historian Xenophon concludes his account of the Peloponnesian War by saying that flute girls marched all up and down the land between the city of Athens and the Piraeus, blowing the auloi. So they were flute girls during the demolition of the walls. And everybody, so according to Xenophon, believed that this was the first day of freedom for all of Greece. In the very dramatic way Xenophon says this, gives an immediate suggestion that this, of course, will not be the case. Now, let me give you a little bit of an aftermath to this in order to conclude this Athenian historical segment of our video series for CLA397. What happened was that Conon was able eventually to get back to Athens and reassume control of the fleet. Our good fellow Theramenes was one of the 30 oligarchs. However, the oligarchs, once again, as with the oligarchic coup in 411 BC, were split between the extreme faction and a more moderate faction. The extreme faction carried out a series of reign of terror-like assassinations and proscriptions on the Athenian populace. They got rid of sycophants, professional informers. That was good. But then they started getting rid of their political rivals. They did it for a while together in unison, but then eventually Theramenes wanted to stop, whereas Critias, a student of Socrates, who was the head of the radical unit, wanted to keep going. These two had a falling out, and eventually Critias publicly struck Theramenes off the list of 30 and had him rounded up and executed. The story goes that when Theramenes was led off to his execution, he pretended to have a cup of wine, and he pretended to offer a toast to Critias by throwing the dregs of the wine cup out in what was a gesture that was referred to as kottabus in Greek. It was a game, apparently, for offering a toast when one drained a wine cup. And Theramenes says, "This is to my really good pal Critias." It was basically his version of flipping the bird on Critias right before his death. And then Theramenes, of course, was executed. In time, some of the Athenian generals who were out in exile were able to reorganize the Athenian army, basically rebel forces, to get back in and recapture Athens from the 30. The Spartans were supposed to support them, but in the end, the Spartans under King Pausanias came up and were able to come to some kind of a deal, rather suspicious circumstances, with the Athenian rebel force. In the end, the Spartans ended up withdrawing the 30 tyrants and allowed the Athenian democracy to be restored from 403 BC down to 401 BC, when the last remnants of the pro-Spartan faction were finally rounded up over at Eleusis. So that really came to nothing. The Spartans were now in control of all of the Athenian former allies. The Spartans were even more dictatorial in the way that they handled those allies than the Athenians had been, and many of them came to regret losing their alliance with the Athenians. Conon ended up beating the Spartans once again in a sea battle, and in 394 BC, Conon actually got the Athenian walls rebuilt. And in time, the Athenians had another fleet, and they built up another league. And they made a lot of the same mistakes again with the second time around, and ended up getting defeated again. But that's another story for another class. In any event, this period of the Peloponnesian War scripted out for the Athenians one of their worst periods of political and military tragedy. So perhaps it's not surprising that it's in this period that we see the great flourishing of the dramatic art of tragedy, as you have now seen with all of our playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. We'll see you next video as we wrap up the course 397 Classics.